I am thrilled for us to have Ambassador Lisa Gable with us. She is author of a book, Turnaround. She has led government initiatives and organizations. She has led nonprofit organizations and boards, and she has led for-profit organizations and been a senior executive in organizations, including at Intel, working with Andy Grove. And I'm definitely going to ask her about that as well. So she has a wide range of experiences. And by the way, she was the youngest political appointee in the Reagan administration. She was a political appointee at age 19. So Lisa Gable, we are thrilled to have you share some of your leadership thoughts with Leadership Greater Washington. Really excited to have you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. That whiskey or scotch tasting sounds very good. So I'm going to have to get to know you all. But it's a pleasure to be here today and talk to you all about turnarounding and transforming. You know, the world after COVID is not, it's hard to believe it's been exactly 3 years. It hasn't come back the way that we wanted it to, right? We've got geopolitical unrest, high inflation, and we've had the bank failure situation over this past weekend. But one thing that I've always seen throughout my career is that when you put me in a box and you tell me there are no more resources, you're constrained, that's when I'm most creative. So what I'd love to do is share a story with you. Are we sharing the screen, Mahan?
Not yet.
There we go. Are we up?
Not yet. At least I don't see it yet. So can you try sharing screen again?
I can. Let's do, I'll come out and see if we can come back. Okay. How are we doing now?
It's sharing screen, and if you want, you can press swap displays, and you got it. We're on.
Great. All right. Sorry about that, folks. We're still figuring all this back and forth stuff out. So what I wanted to do is share with you all a story. As I was saying, you put me in a box, I do better. But I'd like to tell you what box I was in. How would you like to be asked to take a job where your predecessor had put their family on the payroll and been investigated by the FBI, and then their primary funding agency defunded them completely? Well, that was the job that I took when the president asked me to become the U.S. ambassador to the World's Fair, the World Expo in Aichi, Japan in 2005. I have never seen a situation where hubris and truly an utter disregard for results led to an organization getting into bad shape and leading to the defunding by Congress. So I was asked to run the fair 100% with private monies. But that was a little challenging, so I'm going to share a piece of the story, which I call the $10 tuna fish sandwich. My first week on the job, I took my oath of office at Kinko's. I had been brought in very quickly. The State Department couldn't figure out how to manage my swearing in for some reason. They said I needed a notary. Turns out Kinko's has a notary. So I call over, I make an appointment, I run over there, and I tell the lady I'm here to take my oath of office. So she asked me what it was for, and she ran back into her office. She got these little American flags. She set them out on the counter, and then people, you know, who were around the copying machine started asking what was going on. And I stood there and I did so solemnly swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. Everybody was clapping. It was great. I ran back over to the State Department, changed my clothes, and that evening I did a press conference on CNN, worldwide television. It was Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, Dr. Shoshiro Toyoda, Chairman of Toyota Corporation, Ambassador Kato, the Japanese ambassador to the United States. We signed the first half of a bilateral agreement between our countries. I head off, go to the airport, and as I'm getting to the airport the next day, literally pulling up to that Dulles, area, I get a phone call from the State Department attorneys. Hi, Lisa. I'm like, hey, I go, did you see us last night? Did you have a good time at the party? Yeah, we had a great time, but here's the problem. We've been looking back over the rules that Congress passed, and due to the cost overruns and the FBI investigation of your predecessor, we can't find a way for you to have your trip that you're on be paid for. That meant the flight. That meant 2 weeks in Japan, not an inexpensive place to be. So my husband and I hang up the phone and I said, what do I do? And my husband goes, well, you can't embarrass the president of the United States. You just signed one half of a bilateral agreement. We'll pay for it. Get on the airplane. So I fly to Tokyo, do an event at the embassy. We signed the second half of the agreement. And I spent my time contemplating what to do over $10 tuna fish sandwiches on the Ginza. If anybody wants to know where you can get a $10 tuna fish sandwich, I am the person to know. This is why at the same time, the other delegations, the other ambassadors, they were going out to fancy dinners. They were drinking the finest whiskey. But I knew that I had to figure out what I was going to do very, very quickly to get around this very complex process. So I started doing what I always do. I began ranking and rating what it was that we had committed to doing at this fair. Secondarily, is we went through a process of auditing the past. I went through the Inspector General's reports literally for 50 years. The World's Fair has been going on since it launched in Paris and Palace of Fine Arts, Chicago. And we identified where things had gone wrong in the past. And we made a determination that we could reconstruct what we were doing. We could do less, but do it better. And we could actually meet the goals of the United States as well as our Japanese toast. So the first thing we did is we focused on jobs. That was the number one thing. What could we do in order to bring jobs to Americans? 6 months before the fair, we had to raise $32 million in 6 months to pay for it. And we went to the governors of states that did car manufacturing or wanted to move manufacturing plants into their state. And we had them work with the U.S. Foreign and Commercial Service. We had them working with vendors in Japan. And our number one goal is that when we had 19 state delegations come, many that were led by governors, is that each governor would walk in the door and sign an agreement. They'd sign a major agreement. In some cases, they signed a car manufacturing agreement. In others, it was the supply chain. So the CAD/CAM, paint, tires. I learned a lot about paint, more than I ever wanted to. Academic research programs. Everybody walked in signing an agreement. And as a result, we were able to direct billions of dollars of foreign direct investment into the United States. But we had another obligation, and that was the cultural and the diplomatic. Now, again, because we were doing everything on a budget, we made sure that we streamlined our cost structure, but we still had to produce cultural events. We still had to have an experience, a downstairs experience for the people who were coming in and visiting the fair. And there was this big event called U.S. National Day. And on U.S. National Day, we found out that we could get someone to fly in Tommy Lasorda. Tommy was the manager of the LA Dodgers, as you may remember, big character, passed away during, I think, the last couple of years. And we focused on hot dogs and baseball and beer, because that was something that our Japanese hosts were also passionate about. It was the shared love that both of our countries had. And instead of having an elaborate black tie event, instead, I invited everybody, their children, their grandchildren. We had hot dogs, we had beer, we had soda, we had peanuts, we had the USC marching band. Nobody in Japan realized that you don't have marching bands at baseball. It was okay. It all screamed America. And it was ranked as one of the top parties of the entire affair. But it wasn't the novelty and the frugality of the party that set us apart. It was the fact that we figured out what went wrong in the past and how we had to change it. So I want to share one more story with you, and this one is about John F. Kennedy. You may remember, for those of us who are old enough, that when John F. Kennedy proclaimed that a man would go to the moon, that the U.S. would send someone to the moon, he did it and was addressing a nation in a crisis of confidence. To some degree, there were some elements of what was going on back then that are similar to questions that we're facing today. Sputnik had just been launched by the Soviets. Yuri Gagarin, a Russian cosmonaut, had just circled the Earth. And what Kennedy knew is that he had to marshal the support, both material and emotional, of the American people and the scientific community to ensure that the United States would stay the #1 technological superpower, as that was a key element in how we would win the Cold War. As a result of his vision, we did send a man to the moon. We did create new technologies. And later, my boss, Ronald Reagan, would be there and call that Mr. Gorbachev bring down that wall, and it would come down. The critical thing is that you do not have to be a leader of the free world. You don't have to be a US ambassador to the World's Fair. Anybody can figure out how to garner a crisis situation and identify a moment for leadership. There are a couple of things that I've always done that have worked well for me. First and foremost, catch your opponent doing something right. If you're in a conflict with somebody, if you're having a challenge with someone and you need to move forward, but they're causing problems for you, applaud them publicly. We know that sticks work, but carrots work so much better. The second thing is come up with a solution that's going to meet the needs of the consumer. What we knew when we were going into the World Expo is we had to provide cultural support. We also needed to provide an economic path forward that would be beneficial both to our host country, the Japanese, as well as to the United States and the other countries participating. But what we also realized is that not one solution fits all. And so we had to come up with a way of delivering on our obligations, but doing it in a way that would work for 19 different states in a low-cost manner for our production processes. Everything I learned, and that's in my book, I really have to give credit to Intel Corporation. As was mentioned, I worked at Intel when Andy Grove was the CEO, and I had the opportunity to work for my mentor. His name was Dr. Craig Barrett. He was Chief Operating Officer of Intel and then would become CEO and Chairman of the board after Andy. And Craig taught me how to apply manufacturing principles to solving any complex situation. But most importantly, what he taught me is turn the situation on its head and then dig and dig and dig until you identify what the underlying cause is that's causing the situation not to work. With the World Expo, it has had more inspector general's reports, literally had someone that was indicted. If you read this book, Devil in a White City, which is about the World's Fair in Chicago, it's about a serial killer. But if you read the book, what you'll notice is that the World's Fair has always been operationally expensive, has always operated in the US standards when the US has participated at a huge, huge deficit. And there have been a lot of lawsuits over the last number of years around this. And so I was looking, why is that? Why is that? What do they keep doing that's wrong? And I realized there are structural elements about the fair, but I also realized because somebody had to raise a lot of money, build a pavilion, bring people in, have a bunch of parties, that they were spending the money as they were raising it. So when they got to the expo, and this was consistently across the board, they'd spent all the money they raised. Well, all of a sudden you're stuck. You have to perform. You have to give a benefit to the sponsors. And so what did they do? They went over budget to fulfill the obligations for the fundraising that they'd done to promote the programs that they were promoting at that expo. It was the underlying problem. We did something different. Instead, we raised the money in advance. We cut the deals in advance. We set money aside and made sure that every single signing event happened with the funds that have been set aside. And then secondarily, as we piggybacked off of the state's economic development funds and actually had entertainers from each of the states come in on states' existing budgets, not the federal budget. And that's how we were able to produce the only fair in 175 years that's operated under budget without an inspector general's report. When you're in a complex problem, I always tell people, stop focusing on where you're at right now. Visualize the future. What do you want the world to look like? Step number 2 that I talk about in my book is what we did with the fair. Break down the past. Audit, audit, audit. Look for the underlying cause of the real problem. It's never what you think it is. Many, many times in every situation that I've been in, if you dig and dig and dig, what you discover is there's this thing that people keep doing, and that thing is what's causing your inability to move forward. Once you've done this complex process, you can create a path to that visual future that you want to have. But you can only do that if you let things go. You've got to rank and rate. You've got to identify what's job number 1. Job number 1 for the World Expo was creating jobs for Americans, driving investment into the United States. Jobs 2 and 3 were making sure that we fulfilled our cultural as well as diplomatic obligation. And once you've done this extensive process, that allows you to execute with speed, confidence, agility, and heart. I walked into a situation where we were already millions of dollars in debt when I walked in the door. We were doing things the same way they had done it in the past. We were able to raise $32 million in 6 months. We went through this process very quickly, got that door open, and during the 6-month period, the United States Pavilion was voted twice as the best pavilion, best activities, most productive pavilion at the fair. So just to repeat, when you go through the process, start without assumptions, engage in shuttle diplomacy. I flew back and forth 18 times between the United States and Japan. I sat down with people. People were nervous. They knew what had happened in the past. They wanted guarantees and assurances I wasn't going to make the same mistakes. They wanted that guarantee in person, so I was willing to do it. I solved for people's pain points. I found out at the State Department from past employees, current employees, Foreign Service officers, good people, what had caused the pain for them in the past, what had caused those Inspector General's reports. And so we made a commitment that we would solve our situation. We would meet our goals in a manner that protected them. And most importantly, something I learned from my dad is don't treat every step like a battle. It's diplomacy. Engage with people, talk to people, rethink what you're doing, reset what you're doing, communicate to them in a manner that they feel confident that they can move forward with you. Finally, I wanted to give you all a quote from my dad. My father passed away in 2019, and I had a letter that had been stuck in the Bible that was in my office, and I pulled it out at his death. And the letter had been addressed to me when I was 30 years old. I was a middle manager at Intel Corporation, and I was having a really rough time. And what my dad said is, look beyond what's currently in your life. Try to visualize what's unseen, count your blessings. And that's going to enable you to challenge the crisis you're currently experiencing. And then he reminded me that some of the greatest stumbling blocks have ended up being his most successful, greatest stepping stones. So we're facing tough times today, but truly encourage you all to read my book. I've not been in a situation that was ever operating in a good manner before I walked in the door. I know we're in moments of crisis, so I'm hoping that some of these ideas that I put forward can help you all as you're moving through these complex problems. Thank you.
That's great, Lisa. So I want to think about the fact that I mentioned, actually, we have the AI series also coming up. And I think all of our teams and organizations will need elements of what you talked about with respect to a turnaround. I truly believe that, in that we need to be able to pivot and change at a very fast rate for our organizations, whether they are nonprofits or businesses or government agencies and government programs that want to serve the residents. We need to pivot a lot faster. So with that in mind, some of the thoughts and perspectives and what you mentioned comes from the leadership. How were you able to, whether in this, or I know you did the same thing in different organizations, how would you say we should engage our teams and organizations, and eventually transition to engaging boards if necessary, to think through the kind of changes that you talked about?
Yeah, I say two things that I have always done that are very successful for me, but I will tell you that they require discipline and they require very intentional action. The first thing that I do is I research the situation as thoroughly as I possibly can by auditing all the documents that exist. I go back and look at past bylaws. What did you promise people you were going to do when you set up the organization? I look at charters. I look at past marketing materials. I look through memos to find out how people made decisions that they were making. I really, really go through and thoroughly audit what's there. And I go back a number of years, because the problem is in any situation, when something starts to unravel, usually it was many years in the past. It's actually not what you see today. So you've got to go back to the beginning of the string. But one way you also have to do that process of auditing, you got to go talk to people. And you want people's perspectives. You want to make sure that they feel confident giving you a straightforward answer, that nobody's holding back. And the way I do that is I literally go in, I sit down at the desk of the person that is working for me. It may be an employee, or I might go to a customer, I might go to a donor. I sit down in their office, their space, and I ask them to be straightforward and honest and tell me exactly what their perspective is. But the other thing I ask them is, what's your pain point? What's your pain point? Because when you solve a problem, you can't make the whole world happy, but if you can acknowledge what is painful to them, and you come back to them later and say, okay, here's what I found. I did this audit. Here's the data. Here are the facts. Here's how I believe I'm going to be able to solve the problem. Now, my notes tell me that when you and I talked, you said these were your pain points. These were the places that had caused problems for you in the past. I've designed this solution because I actually think that's going to take care of your pain points as well as help us solve the problem. Now, in some cases, I can't do what it is that they want me to do, because the other thing you may have noticed I said is we rank and rate. You have to get rid of stuff. So there might be times where there's something that everybody loved doing, they love doing, but you can't afford to do it anymore. That was what the expo was. We had to stop people from doing stuff that they loved. That's hard. So again, speak with facts. Just be very clear. Heard what you said. Here's what's going on. I can't do the thing that you love anymore, and here's why. And be very, very truthful. I was head of a not-for-profit that did walks, and I had to end the walks. What I discovered is we were spending $2 million a year to bring in $1 million. Not only were we out of whack on our money, but then when I took and audited all the time the staff was spending, the cost to us was far more than $2 million. And so I was very honest with people. I said, it's costing me $2 million, this amount of man hours. Our job isn't to produce walks, our job's research. And we can't fund research when everybody's running around organizing the Saturday walk. And so you have to be honest with people.
By the way, it's interesting, in some of those walks, how little money actually those nonprofits make. You always assume that there's a lot of money being made. So you got rid of things. You've also been able to bring together industry and advocates, and you did this specifically in reducing the calorie that is in foods. How were you able to bring different groups together, as well as lead a board at the same time? So those are two different questions, but
Right.
You talked about the fact that we need to see things from the other person's point of view. You mentioned catch your opponent doing something right. You had opponents in industry and advocates for healthier food. And then you had a board of directors that you had to manage. How were you able to prioritize those?
Oh, there's another story I tell, getting to the big idea can be painful. It can be very, very painful. To give the people who are watching a little background, I was asked by Indra Nooyi, who was CEO of PepsiCo at the time, and 16 of her peers to launch an initiative that would be the largest self-regulatory initiative in the history of the food and beverage industry. They had been they being the CEOs, had been in conversations with the top leaders in public health around the nation. They had a problem. The two groups did not get along. Public health was watching the rise of obesity rates in the United States, and they were laying the blame on the shoulders of the food and beverage companies that they were accusing of peddling sugar and fat to Americans that like to eat. And so when I originally brought the companies and the teams together, we brought in the chief regulatory and scientific officers of the companies. We brought in the chief scientist at a number of public health organizations. We put them in a room and we tried to determine how we could reformulate, change the recipe of America's favorite products in a manner that would help us reduce the problem of obesity. And so what people did is they started focusing on lots of little things. Well, if we did this with sodium, and if we did this with sugar, and if we did this with fat, if we did this with marketing, and we would have whiteboards up and nobody could come to an agreement. And one reason they couldn't come to an agreement, and this gets into how you manage boards, those companies made very distinctly different products. So you had Kellogg's and General Mills making cereal. You had Coca-Cola and PepsiCo making sodas. And you had Nestle and Hershey making chocolate. Two things to know. Yes, you can take sugar out of sodas, But there is a international regulatory process for chocolate. You actually can't change the way chocolate's made. You have to go talk to these people in Brussels, which is the chocolate capital of the world, and get their permission to make changes. And there's a quality and a standard to chocolate that's agreed upon that no one can change. With cereal, USDA, Department of Agriculture, has rules about how cereal is made, how it's measured, how the ingredients are measured. So there are certain things you can't change in cereal. The other is none of the products were the same, so you couldn't make the same change in soup, bread, ice cream, pizzas, frozen foods. So we went through 6 months of process, and finally the CEO of McCormick said, okay, we're all tired of this. Everybody's fighting because if you make this change over here, then Pepsi's not happy. If you make this change over here, then Kellogg ends up not being able to benefit from it. And their competitor, General Mills, will make a lot of money. We had a lot of those conversations. And so he put us into what's called the Idea Lab at McCormick. McCormick's the spice company. You got the spices in your kitchen. And they have this idea lab that when people are reformulating products, they bring customers in and they look at how to use the composition of spices and product management and consumer taste to make changes and introduce new products. And it's run by these people that were trained at McKinsey and BCG. And I met with all of them in advance. And we talked about how do we set up a process, a conversation to bring a group of people who've not gotten along, who don't agree on anything, to get them to a conclusion. What happened is we bring them in for 2 days and we kept narrowing. We kept eliminating places that would not work for everybody. Things that if you made this change, it would hurt these companies. And let me tell you, the CEOs would call and yell at me in the middle of the night if I did that. And they did. Ultimately, we had the chief scientist of the Campbell Soup Company. She was sitting in the corner with the renowned epidemiologist. They were working away. They pounce up and they said, it's all about calories. And at that moment, we had our answers, because what we knew is if we reduced calories, the only common denominator amongst 35% of the food that these companies made, which was sold in America, 35% of the food was made by these companies, calories was the only common denominator. If you'd reduce calories, you would reduce sugar and fat. And there we had a solution. But we kept through the entire process. I would come back from those meetings. I would document what we agreed to. I would document what we didn't agree to. I kept funneling as we got closer and closer to an agreement. And then ultimately we used process to come through to that breakthrough idea. And I constantly communicated with every single CEO what we were doing, acknowledging what they didn't want to have happen because it would mess them up from a competitive standpoint. And I did a lot of shuttle diplomacy through the entire process. Finally, when we made the announcement as to what we would do, we called up a lot of people who had been public health advocates that you read about in the newspaper. Whenever there's anything about the food and beverage company, those are the people that go to the New York Times and get interviewed and tell them how bad things are. And we called them all in advance and we told them what we were going to do. And we talked them through it so that when we made the announcement, we only had positive stories and everybody was on board and it worked.
And that's outstanding, Lisa. And I think I know a lot of people in LGW care about many issues in the region, whether it is housing affordability and homelessness issues or other issues. We do need to learn lessons like the ones that you share with respect to bringing disparate groups together and eliminating and getting to options and action items that can benefit rather than having conversations, ongoing conversations forever. Even I had a conversation with Ann Kress, who is head of at Nova, Northern Virginia Community College. And we were talking about the fact that even on the workforce issues, for 20 plus years, there is talk about the needs of the workforce, the needs of the companies, and the lack of adequate training that's done. So I think the process that you talk about is important as we look to tackle regional issues as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the process that I learned when I was at Intel, I've applied in every situation. Every situation, you have to understand the underlying cause of the problem. And again, not the knee-jerk reaction. And you have to be willing to go deep and dig beyond what people are saying politically, because we do know that all of these conversations have been highly politicized. And so that's where I tell people, start without assumptions. I don't care if you agree with somebody politically. I don't want you to start the conversation assuming you know why the person wants to do the thing they're recommending. That is the number one mistake we make as humans, is that we assume we know why that person believes something. We assume we understand why that person doesn't want something to happen. And the reality is, I have never, ever, ever sat down with somebody and had them confirm my assumptions. I was wrong. I was wrong. When you really dig into it. And so you have to understand why that person's where they're at. And then what you have to do is acknowledge that pain point in every conversation. And the ranking and rating process, really analyzing at a we can't do everything. We can't do everything. I mean, I think we have put so much of a burden on every structure in the United States to solve so many problems that we've got to step back and allow people to focus on what they do best. And we need to applaud them when they actually get rid of things, take their resources and say, I do this the best. You do that the best. Let's partner. Let's align our incentives to change. Let's do it together. And why don't we grab this person over here because they do this other thing well? When Intel went from having a deficit of sales in the semiconductor world because the Japanese had actually beating the United States in semiconductors in the late 1980s, they went to Microsoft and IBM, and they did joint sales calls. They did joint sales calls. They went to IT managers. Intel's like, we make the brains in the computer. Those guys make the software. These guys make the hardware. And then they got the IT people to purchase the whole kit and caboodle. And that is how they all penetrated the market as a team. And then later with Dell and other people through the Intel Inside program. So narrow what you're doing, focus on the number one thing you do the best, be willing to acknowledge someone else's pain points, don't make assumptions, and link arms and run up those mountains.
And by the way, Lisa, what you're mentioning is one of the biggest challenges that I see in the teams that I work with, in that the executives are overstretched, overwhelmed, overburdened. And when I ask them to focus and eliminate, they have a very hard time. The teams have a very hard time. We all come up with reasons why we need to continue doing everything we have been doing. However, there is tremendous power after going through the pain of eliminating things to focus on those top priorities. It's really, really hard to do. There is a big struggle, but there is real value to it. So in order to explain that a little better, I also know you're a big advocate, having spent time at Intel with Andy Grove, of objectives and key results. And you implemented OKRs in the teams and organizations that you have worked with throughout the years. Would love for you to explain how that thinking works and how those that watch this participate can implement it with their teams and organizations to be able to produce better results.
Yeah, one book I would recommend that you read is Measure What Matters by John Doerr. What John Doerr did in the book is he took Andy Grove's principles of manufacturing, which were part of his publications called High Output Management, and he simplified it so that it would be usable by people outside of the manufacturing arena. Andy introduced the concept of job one. In order for Intel to be able to do back then what it had to do, reclaim market share from the Japanese, and then become the leader in semiconductors, is everything centered around what will sell semiconductors, everything. What does it cost to make them? What does it cost to sell them? What does it cost to deliver them? That's all we did. That was job one. So the reason OKRs work well is if you can narrow down to job one, what's the number one thing we have to do to survive and thrive? All other actions within the company ladder up to that, right? You've got people with different activities, channel marketing, manufacturing, sales, human resources. Each one has to take actions that meet the number one goal. And so if each person every quarter has to identify what their actions are, and they have to be clear about it. You can't use qualitative statements. You have to say, I will take this action to meet this objective as measured by. It has to have a quantitative element to it. Your quantitative element might be that you're going to meet with 5 new customers. And then your quantitative element by Q3 might be that you land one of the 5 new customers or 10 or whoever it is. It may be within your manufacturing processes that you use statistical process control and you begin to eliminate the variables. We're going to eliminate these variables. That's going to increase our output by X, and we're going to do it by this time, and it's going to cost us this much money. So the key with OKRs is what's at the top of the ladder, what actions is every person in the organization taking to meet that goal, and then how do they measure their outputs? How do they measure the value of what it is that they're doing? You can change your OKR, you can modify them because look, things happen. You might have a hurricane that, takes out part of your manufacturing line. You might have a power problem. You might have COVID and people get sick. You might have a lot of things happen. So you can make adjustments, but the reality is for you to get to that end goal, the math doesn't lie. Math doesn't lie. It always adds up to the same thing. And so you keep the math the same, even though the way that you have to achieve it may end up fluctuating based on economic realities or political realities or conditional environmental issues.
And one of the challenges I see, and again, I would urge everyone to think about this, whether they head up an organization for their organization, or they head up a team or group of people for their team. One of the challenges I see is clarifying what is job one. A lot of times that description, that understanding is all encompassing because we want everything to be part of it, and therefore nothing becomes a priority. Having clarity on that job one, even when I think about LGW, Leadership Greater Washington, what is this organization's job one? And then based on that, the measures that contribute to that job one, that clarity can really, really help. Even with not just the board membership of LGW, sometimes people want the organization to do one thing, sometimes they want to do another, sometimes they want to get more active in the community. When there's clarity on job one, then people are clear on both what the purpose of the organization is, as well as what are the measures that show us whether we are headed in that direction of achieving job one or not, both with respect to teams and individuals.
Absolutely. And we saw it this past weekend with Silicon Valley Bank. They were doing a lot of stuff, but they weren't managing risk. What's their job? Their job was increasing value for their shareholders and their customers and ensuring that no risk could impede their ability to do so. That was their job. They had lots of committees, and this isn't a political statement. It gets down into focus. It's about focus. Why were they running off, setting up this committee and that committee and spending money on this and that? And they forgot we have to hire a risk officer. That's what we have to do. I know it seems really obvious to the rest of us, but you're a bank. You don't need to be doing all that other stuff. And in fact, by ensuring that they decrease the risk for those holdings that they were trusted with, they were then able to see greater impact on DEI and ESG because the companies that they were funding, who actually had programs and products and new innovations in place that would help solve for the problems identified in those key categories, they would continue to live and thrive. But the only way they could do so is if their money was safe.
That would have been their job one. So I don't want to go too far down on that tangent, The other thing, though, Lisa, that you have done and would love to get your thoughts, because everyone that participates in LGW serves on a board, and many people lead boards as chairs, and some of our nonprofits, again, presidents and CEOs that have their boards. Would love your thoughts on how to most effectively lead boards and how to most effectively contribute as a board member.
Well, every board member needs to remember that their job is governance and fiduciary responsibility. That's it. That's your job. And it's the CEO's job to manage the day-to-day. Again, going back to using OKRs, what I would do is we would present every board book within the context of meeting our OKRs. We presented our budget within the context of our OKRs. Everything, again, came back to what's job one, how are we going to meet the goals of the organization, meeting job one, financially, what's it going to cost us to do there, and then how are we going to protect the investment of those who are our donors, our consumers, our shareholders, whatever they are, in order to achieve the objective that they're funding. The other thing I remind people is you're working with other people's money. And sometimes CEOs will forget that. All of a sudden it becomes their money to use. It's not your money to use. You raised that money. Someone gave you that money. Someone invested in you. Someone's buying your products because they want this one thing that you promised them you were going to do. So you're dealing with other people's money. And the second is that you are tying all decisions back to governance and oversight. You are ensuring that the fiduciary management of the organization to meet the objectives as outlined is happening within the context of rules of governance, and that you're within the public trust.
And that is essential, but it requires therefore clarity of those OKRs for the CEO in that reporting back to the board. One of the things that I see lacking in some of the nonprofits that I've been involved with is that, yes, the board members have gotten more involved than they should in the business, but the reporting is also not aligned with, one, as you mentioned, fiduciary responsibility. A lot of people have a decent understanding of that, but also the key objectives and how the organization is doing toward those key objectives.
Right. You were, I mean, there's a word called the public trust. That is what, if you're not for profit, you have, that is your number one obligation. The government has given you C3 status to do a particular charitable activity. It could be research, it could be medical research, it could be anything. They have trusted you to be operating within the rules and structures as outlined within rules of governance. That is where, again, it's not your money, it's other people's money. And there's nothing that does bother me more. And I just had this conversation with somebody about an academic institution that makes a decision to take the money from the donor that was to do one thing, and they use it for something else. You're not allowed to do that. There is the public trust. It is actually a legal term. You have to fulfill it. In coming up with an understanding and a clarity of what your board responsibilities are and what they are not. And the other thing is, if you get into micromanaging the organization, it never works. It never works. One, your CEO is not going to want to stay. Secondarily is, if your CEO is reporting back to you in a very crisp process every quarter, tying their expenditures back to the budget you approve an annual budget. If you approve an annual budget that's based on a series of actions that are identified within your OKRs, you're in pretty good shape, because all you have to do is keep seeing, did they meet the goal and how much money did they spend to meet it? Are they over budget or are they under budget? And that's where dashboards and the green, red light, yellow comes into play, because that's what you need to focus on. That needs to be one of the biggest items you focus on.
Yeah, that clarity is really important. I agree with you. Measure What Matters is a great book to get started on that front, on the OKRs. And in Turnaround, you both give great examples and great stories in supporting it as well. Would love to wrap up on getting a thought that again relates to some of the conversations in the LGW, Lisa. You have been, in your experience, both in government and in nonprofit, able to bring people with very different opinions to the table to get great things done. And one of the challenges that I hear and I see is that in our conversations, in our community, we've gotten, it's become a lot harder for us to have conversations with people whose views we disagree with. And I don't necessarily mean on a political front, but you take it cross sector. So, how can we think about it and how can we do a better job at pulling disparate groups together toward achieving a shared positive outcome?
So Ronald Reagan, when I was working at the White House, had a term, the 80-20 rule. If you could agree with somebody 80% of the time and agree to disagree in the 20%, you could do business. I've changed that to the 60-40 rule. And what I do is I am very direct in my meetings. Again, I'm a big believer in the whiteboards and the meeting minutes, and saying exactly what we all agreed to. If we can agree on 60%, we acknowledge it. We say, this is what we agreed to. These are the objectives. You may not agree on how to get there. That's where you have to do the process, but you agree at least on this 60%. Publicly acknowledge you're never going to cross the line on the 40%. None of you are. There are certain things that you fundamentally do not believe are the right thing to do. Take the 40%, acknowledge it, be open about it. You can have your arguments about it, but focus all your energies with that person on the 60% and just start knocking those topics off one by one.
And that's a good thought for us to have as, again, we tackle issues, whether in our organizations or especially working together in the community. Really appreciate the leadership you have shown in whether nonprofit, government, or business. Appreciate your book, Lisa, and you are a local to us, Leadership Greater Washington, in this region. Rebecca put a link in show notes. Would love to get feedback from those of you participating. Thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts on leading, especially turnarounds, Ambassador Lisa Gable. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining, and look forward to seeing you for the artificial intelligence series that LGW is offering, as well as seeing you in person. Big virtual hugs to everyone.